welcome everyone to this workshop on the insurance roadmap. I'm Tony Randall. I'm filling in for Bruce Robinson, who, due to plane hold-ups, could not make it here, but he is with us online, and I'm looking forward to his contribution as well. This is a workshop which is a result of some new information that's come out from the insurance roadmap, and we've been asking for this for quite a long time, and now we need to be taken through it because it does have some indirect impact, some important indirect impact on the long-term plan, and so we need to know in that mix where that goes. And so I'll hand over to Andrea, unless Barbara wants to say anything to start with. Okay, hand over to you, Andrea. Thank you very much.
Kia ora koutou. So I've got my insurance gurus from Council here with me today, so Sarah and Andy, and online we've got Sam and Matt from Aon. So kia ora, Matt. Nice to see you. I know Matt from a different life, so nice that he's supporting Wellington City Council here as well. So yes, you're absolutely right. What we want to talk through is the loss modelling that we have done. This is can we put it onto the next slide? Sarah's pushing the button and holding her tongue in the right way to try and get it to the next slide. So this slide will hopefully be familiar to many of you, certainly for those of you that sit on the Audit and Risk Committee. This is the work program that we have been working towards for a large component of the life cycle of the insurance roadmap. And we're at this point, the first big curve in the road, where we've been undertaking loss modelling. Now, in our previous reports to the Audit and Risk Committee, the updates have been talking about how crucial this loss modelling is, because this has been a huge component of the work that we've been undertaking up until this point. So you're right, Chair, in that we've been waiting this with bated breath. But just to highlight, we have given this to you almost immediately as it's become available. So, received the report on the 13th in its final capacity. And then we updated it for the way that we format it on the 14th. So to go into the paper that you received as part of the Audit and Risk Committee papers. And so it is really live, and you would have received the report alongside it. It's quite technical in nature, and so what we wanted to do is really kind of sit down with you today and talk through the nuances of it, try and answer any of your questions about that, and we certainly have our experts from Aon here as well. So I'm going to start by highlighting what we've done in the past versus what we've done in this loss modelling and what this report entails, because they're two different things, although it helps give us a much better understanding of our risk. And I think there's a real success story in this, and I do want to recognise the work that the Council has done on this insurance roadmap to help give us that better understanding of the range of the risks that we are exposed to. But first, we've been doing this thing called deterministic loss modelling. And that kind of modelling is best used in a scenario to kind of inform the worst case scenario. It applies, in terms of the modelling itself, it applies consistent shaking across a portfolio of assets. It doesn't require the more detailed GIS mapping, and it's based on modelling that we last fully completed in 2015, and we've continued to update it for all of the information that we've had to hand. And so we've updated it every year. We update our under insurance risk when we have more information. So whenever we go to the market for large chunks of our insurance, we update that modelling, and that has been used for obviously some time. What it does do, it also includes this concept called surge demand. And the best way I can describe that is post a disaster scenario, you will have always a bit of a peak in terms of costs, where you have construction costs, things like that, being a lot higher than you would in an ordinary environment. And we certainly saw that play out in Canterbury post the Canterbury earthquakes. I suspect they may be seeing that across the Hawke's Bay, where you have numerous assets all being rebuilt at the same time with limited construction capacity, and there's an element of increased costs that come with that. And so we've used that in previous loss modelling. So we continue to use that in the past, but we have moved towards this more probabilistic loss modelling, as we've outlined in the roadmap and as we've been signalling we've been doing for some time. And that loss modelling is better suited to sort of long-term financial planning, and it provides a more probable scenario, and I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But what it has done is we've been able to take the use of information from GNS that was released in 2022, and during this time we've also been building our data set, so we've got better information not only in-house and building our data set early in the roadmap, as well as better information from GNS, and we've been able to start to pull these together for this particular modelling that you've got here today. In terms of the probable scenario, what it does is this type of modelling allows a much more granular approach to be taken. So it can say, well, if an earthquake happens over here, based on the position of the asset, the age of the asset, all of those kind of things that can mirror the kind of probable damage to that asset. So it's much more specific than saying, there's a whole big event right across the city. So it's more, it gives us a more refined kind of view of what could happen. So ground condition, specific parameters of the earthquake, it uses a catalogue of more than 100,000 earthquakes to actually scenario test these things. So it's much more sophisticated to give us that probable scenario. So how did we get from 2.6 billion to 1.8 billion? Just going back. What we haven't done in this scenario is we have not included the surge demand. So we've not included any kind of metric or multiplier in the 1.8 to indicate that the cost of construction is likely to be higher in this kind of scenario. We've not applied any kind of surge demand, however it has been in there in the past. And one thing that we were actually going to ask the Audit and Risk Committee is whether or not you would like that level of detail in here, because we're happy to provide it. I mean, this is, as I say, this is a live report. We're pulling off this information, and we could in fact get that included in this report if the Audit and Risk Committee wanted us to do so, and we'll ask that question when we meet as a committee. So how did we get from 2.6 billion to 1.8 billion? So a huge number of factors, and this is where our insurance roadmap has really started to play out. So the areas on the left-hand side of your screen, we were successful in getting additional cover of 120 million in our last round of insurance cover, and that was through taking a very specific type of approach to the market, being very clear on the risks that we faced, being clear on what we're doing to mitigate those risks so that the industry themselves can see what we're actually doing. We have spent millions and millions of dollars in building resilience. So new builds like Tākina, the work that we're doing on the town hall, Te Matapihi, with base isolators, they have also helped this scenario. And of course, the work that we're doing to improve our asset data right across the council has improved the granularity that we can model to. And so these are all the things that since 2022 we've been working on in our insurance roadmap to actually achieve this result. So I do want to highlight that this is a really good news story from that perspective. The work that we have been doing to pursue this has actually transpired to have some really good risk mitigation impact here. The real differences when we look at the approach comes down to where we're expecting the losses. So in the probabilistic areas, we've actually seen that there's a decrease to the risk of Three Waters portfolio and our transportation portfolio. And that's largely because those assets are dispersed right across the city. They're not necessarily in one place where an earthquake would have the intensity, and so you would expect the damage to those assets to be less affected in certain places. The building and the vertical assets, certainly from the resilience that we've been doing, we're seeing less of a risk, but that isn't necessarily the case with the housing portfolio. Those assets are grouped together in quite key areas, and actually we've seen an increased risk in that space. So what does all of this mean? And this is the last slide that I'm going to talk to before opening up to questions. So in effect, we have, under these two different modelling scenarios, we've got a worst case and we've got a more likely scenario. And the more likely scenario is the one that we should be using from our long-term long-term risk planning. And it's what we've been working towards under this insurance roadmap. The worst case scenario is still appropriate to inform the additional capacity that we still need, right? You know, when we're talking about risk, we never say we're going to land on this specific number, and that's something that we've always done at this council, as opposed to these are the range of risks. And we're starting to build up a picture of the range of exposure that we have. I've noted the actions that we've undertaken in the roadmap have had a significant effect. And I'd note that $1.8 billion is still a significant amount of risk. So despite everything that we've been doing, we still have a risk in the billions that cannot be managed on the balance sheet alone. I've talked about further modelling, and actually we want to continue to invest in this space, and there is more information outlined in the ARC paper on that, and further next steps that we want to talk through the Audit and Risk Committee as well. So I'm going to leave it at there and open up for questions.
Thank you. So all in all, this is a good news story.
It's a very good news story.
And hopefully councillors can take that on board. So just straight to questions. Ben.
Kia ora. Look, yeah, this is good news, but I guess it did catch us all quite substantively off guard. We had two really good quality briefings last week, including on this topic, but there was no sort of reference that this was going to come or that this was in progress. So I guess, can you just give us a little bit of context of how it dropped in terms of being, why didn't we at least have some reference last week that this work was imminent? So
we have been talking to the Audit and Risk Committee continuously about this work, and we did highlight that. I think that the key thing here is that as this work has been undertaken, we have consistently updated the Audit and Risk Committee on that. At the Audit and Risk Committee last, I think it was Councillor Randall asked the question, what is the impact likely to be? And we noted that from our discussions with Aon, they did not expect that to have a significant impact on the approach that we are taking. And that is the guidance and advice that we've been providing to the council throughout this period.
Okay, so I guess following that up, so when the underinsurance gap was $2.6 billion, your view of what's prudent is basically $1 billion of debt headroom. In terms of the context for the entire LTP, $500 million of that being underinsurance gap, $500 million of that being other risks. Now we're at $1.8 billion. Is $1 billion still the prudent figure in your view?
So I think, just to be clear, what we have got is we've got two key significant risks in our financials and our balance sheet. We've got one risk being the undiversified portfolio, and our investments all being undiversified. So we have a level of risk there that we need to mitigate. That's outside of this insurance risk. The second risk that we face is an underinsurance risk as well. $1.8 billion is still a significant amount of risk, and so our approach to mitigating, whether it's 1.8, whether it's 2.6, whether it's 3 billion, we're never going to be able to manage that in the same way that other councils are managing it through their debt headroom alone. And this is still more significant than what we're proposing to manage through our debt headroom. So our advice on our financial strategy still stands.
Okay. And last one, this can come through in a written answer if it's more appropriate, but are there any reports, work streams, undertakings or reviews that are currently, operationally underway that could potentially materially change the impact or the underpinnings for the LTP amendment that we're expecting to land before the LTP amendment's adopted in 30 June next year?
No, I'm not aware of anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
No.
Thank you, Iona.
Well, it was a very pleasant surprise. Thank you for starting my weekend off so well. So well done to the team for getting that outcome. That's really, really positive. So I'm just wondering if you've done any thinking, I don't like BCRs, but just use it as a convenient term of strengthening. So the hundreds of millions that we've put in, for example, into the town hall in Te Matapihi, in terms of then the benefit we get back. Can you able to break that down a little bit?
We haven't done that kind of analysis, and I think that would be more appropriate to do, if I understand your question correctly, Councillor, at the business case scenario as we're looking to do business cases for new buildings or upgrades. I think that would be the most appropriate time to ensure we're doing those kind of things, because I think if I understand what you're asking correctly, we've had a significant, we've spent significant amount of money on new builds and earthquake strengthening, but is that really achieving the benefit that would?
Yeah, and I mean, we are going to have to do it for existing buildings and infrastructure. Yeah.
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely.
The next question I had is you seem to say we should be using attenuated shaking, but not the specific disaster scenarios. I just wondered, they look like they both had benefits. Do we have to choose one?
That's just part of the nature of this particular type of modelling. That's the messaging there was that is what one of the assumptions, or the assumption I'm looking to Sam now, that this modelling was based on, as opposed to just shocking the whole system with the exact same 1 in 1,000 year event under the deterministic modelling.
Sam, do you want to speak to that from Aon?
Yeah, happy to. So basically, we need both of these for good decision making. So if you can imagine, losses scale from frequency events to severity events. The probabilistic gives you the curve all the way through from one end to the other, frequency to severity. Deterministic, because there are lots of assumptions as we go through on a probabilistic loss modelling, the uncertainty becomes greater and greater the more infrequent the event is. So to give us more definition around the big events, we pick specific scenarios and run those. So ideally what we want to be doing is you need both. You need frequency to understand the more regular and likely events, and then deterministic is really good for informing how much insurance is likely to be needed. So typically a client wouldn't just use probabilistic and say that's going to be my loss limit. They'd say, okay, that gives me an understanding of the risk. What is my worst case scenario? And maybe use that as the loss limit determining factor. So does that help? I think the answer is we need both to make an informed decision.
Yeah, and that was just my last question for now, just following on from that then. It was just, when you change the baseline, sometimes that can be a bit problematic, right? Because then you're not sure where you are. Yeah. So you're saying then you will use both models.
Yeah, I think, look, it's really challenging because as you get new information, how you describe it in a way that makes sense to how you've been talking about it previously, there's a balance with that compared to changing a discussion around a range or, the different models. It's not even really a range. It's two separate different modelling and how we just talk about it. So I think, on reflection, we've kind of put it out there and explained it in the same way, but we've tried to explain the nuances of how we've landed with this. And I think in our financial strategy going forward, we might explain it in slightly different ways as well to highlight the two different scenarios. I think that would be useful to the public as well.
Yeah, thank you. If I could go back on the list. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Ray.
Thanks very much for this, and I have to say that I'm pleased with this new model that we're actually using. But can I just get clarification on the this new method that we're actually using? They're suggesting that in the event of a large earthquake, the probability of that earthquake actually damaging a huge section of the city as opposed to a smaller section of the city. So, for example, it's not going to destroy the whole city. Like we've heard before, that if the earthquake hits it's bad enough to munt the airport, then it's going to do the city as well. But using this probability method, it's not going to do that, are they? And so I see that there are differences between assessing which parts of the city are going to be damaged, because if you compare the CBD, for example, as being our most valuable part, against, say, Kilburnie, which is only redeeming asset is having a KFC there, there's a huge difference.
Ray.
But there's a huge difference in the cost.
Yep.
So
Here's
are
the
we
question,
averaging out the difference between these different areas?
We're not averaging out, but perhaps, and there are different things, Ray, you're absolutely right, but perhaps I'll hand it over to Aon and they can just explain that probabilistic modelling a wee bit more.
Yeah, certainly. So the difference between the two approaches here, one is the probabilistic takes 100,000 events and says, how is each of those events going to impact Wellington as in its entirety and all those assets, and they all get different levels of shaking per event. And why it's complex and all the rest of it, that's why it takes time to model it. So that gives you that full curve of, from a small event or a large event far away or a small event locally. It gives you all those alternatives. The key thing is that one of the things you've got to understand is that when you're loss modeling, a key component is we assume that all assets are perform in an average way. So deterministic gives you that opportunity to stress test and say, yes, it's an over pessimistic view of how all the assets will perform. But we know that within a portfolio, there's going to be one or two valuable buildings which will perform unexpectedly. Others will perform well. Those don't really matter. But for a big building, if it underperforms, you kind of want to cater for that in your modeling so that you don't assume the average and underestimate what the losses are going to be. So the idea is you need both. You need to have that full understanding of the curve and what's likely to happen, but then also a more sense check of, because that deterministic event exists within that portfolio of losses that you just determined probabilistically, but you just want to deep dive a little bit more and test the assumptions around the modeling for that extreme event. And that's what the deterministic is. So I agree with you. And we often look at a higher level of shaking over a key proportion of the assets, usually the higher value end. And again, it is pessimistic in that approach. But that's what you want to be doing from a loss modeling perspective, and certainly when you're looking to set limits.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Durman.
Thank you, Andrea. My question is, let's take it another way. If on the weekend, on Thursday, when we received that, the outcome was the insurance risk increasing by 800 million. Instead of 2.6 billion, it becoming 3.4 billion. Would you be still advising us to keep that only 1 billion?
Yeah.
500 above and down. If for me, it just looks like a bit, when it's down, to some extent, it's still we can make it instead of 1 billion, making, let's say, 800, define what that financial prudence looks like.
Yeah. So look, the scenario would still be the same. And the reason for that is because what we're saying here is that we're never going to be able to mitigate that under insurance risk through debt alone. that cannot be achieved at this point in time, and it's not going to be achieved, right? So what we're proposing in our financial strategy is to manage a significant amount of risk through ensuring that we can self-insure or respond by having extra debt capacity. So the movement up or down, given it's so significant, their ranges, their models, it's not tied to the specific number, it's tied to the amount of risk that we are facing as an organisation. So if it had gone up by 800,000 or 400,000, our advice would still be the same, because you're never ever going to be able to offset that against debt alone.
Just to follow up on that, back that on 2022, the debt was about 1.4 billion, is that right? And at the time, we don't have similar debt headroom, and the 1 billion you're talking. How that is now different compared to 2022?
So if you'll recall our journey in terms of our insurance, what we've been on is a journey where in 2021, where we prepared our long-term plan, we had an under-insurance risk, and that was only 272 million. So we felt that we could mitigate that reasonably easily within our debt capacity. We could take that as a valid option in mitigating our risk. And so that is the risk that the council took at that point in time. Fast forward to the GNS and the National Seismic Modelling being released, that plus our revaluation of assets, which increased the cost of construction significantly, meant that we could no longer take that approach. So what we've been doing throughout the preparation of this 24-34 long-term plan and the financial strategy that we've developed is how do we mitigate that? This has been a journey that we're on. Over this time, though, we've also been spending an awful lot of money on capital program and increasing our debt headroom. And what our advice is that you can no longer do both. We need to be able to get our debt down to manage the risks that we're facing with this under-insurance risk, as well, in order to mitigate that.
Another question? Yeah, one more.
So if we just push a little bit 3 years forward now, how that gonna play out? Because if it has changed from 2021 to now, from 270 to 1.8 billion, and now we need 1 billion, and just play out. So, just give me what it looks like after 3 years.
Yeah. So the challenge here, Councillor, is that we're never going to be able to mitigate that risk via debt headroom alone, and that's the point. That was why Council officers' recommendation in mitigating this risk was to sell the airport shares and establish a PIF, because we knew that perpetual investment fund could grow over time. And so that was why we were looking to mitigate that risk through putting it into that kind of fund. We're going to be exposed, and we'll be continuing to raise these risks in future years.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brown.
In terms of the amount of cost of a potential disaster, I'm quite surprised that you wouldn't just be recommending that the rebuild cost would be the one that would actually be the worst case, because after all, if everyone to say you've got a replacement value of a building today of X, but if you think it's actually going to cost you X plus.
Yeah.
So would that be your advice to the audit committee, that they should be recommending that the loss is actually the rebuild cost?
I think yes, but I think this is another good suite of information that we have available to us, and this is all about understanding what our risks are and actually working towards mitigating what those are. And my point is that we're never, we're trying to mitigate to the best of our ability, but we can't mitigate to that highest level.
No,
yeah.
But you still want to know
the probabilistic level. Yeah, sorry.
The other question is about the timeline issue, where the one of the 100 is only $1.2 billion worth of potential debt, and I don't really understand why that figure is so low, given I think last week when you were talking about the probabilities of a major earthquake in Wellington in the next 50 years, it was quite high. So to end up with 1.2 billion as the worst case for 100 years versus the 500-year of about 3 billion, I was just surprised that the 100 years was such a low figure, especially when I looked down the list of individual items.
Yeah.
I can't really believe that the cable car is only expecting, that's their worst case.
Yeah. Aon, are you able to answer that question?
So the way this works is that the 100-year event is a 1% likelihood of it happening in a given year. And so there's a range of events which are potentially going to happen, like a 100-year flood or other sort of 100-year events. These are ones which you're likely, unfortunately, to experience any given year. And so it's just a component of, it could be a large earthquake that's quite far away from Wellington that has an impact, or it could be a moderate earthquake very close to Wellington. But it's just that what is the level of impact is measured as that is what's likely for a 1% chance of it happening. The issue is that the energy for those different levels of earthquake is exponentially more. So, for instance, the Christchurch earthquake, which was devastating, the Alpine fault is going to be 1,000 times more powerful than the Christchurch event. And it's just a matter of, well, is it close to Wellington or is it far away? So what you experience will be, it could be, if it was in Fiordland, it might be felt as a 1 in 100 year or even less of that event in Wellington. Unfortunately, if it's close to the top of the South Island, it might be that 500 or 1,000 year event that impacts. So the curve is just basically giving a representation for each of those periods in time, the likelihood, and it's above that. So it's the exceedance of that. So a 500-year event is that amount, and it can be more than that. Does that help?
Okay.
You've perplexed him sufficiently. That's
Thank
good.
you. So I'm conscious of time and I want to be everyone fair, so I'd like everyone just to have 2 questions instead of 3. So Councillor Rogers.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could clarify for me, and the graph that you have used in the table, it appears that the maximum amount of loss that we're looking for, as predicted in November 2024, adds up to about $4 billion. But then later on in the Aon report, the estimated loss for a 1,000 year is 3.6. So I was wondering what the $400 million difference is there.
Yeah, no problem. So the modelling undertaken included the uninsured roading assets and all of the insured assets. It did not include some of the uninsured assets that were on the waterfront and in the building portfolio. So what we've done is we've also added those assets in so that we can represent the full total risk.
Right, okay. And then my other question, this might be for Aon, was around, for the loss exceedance, is that in any year-long period, or is that in a calendar year? Because I'm just thinking back to like Christchurch, for example, where they had some insurance policies that were based on a year and some of them that were based on a calendar year.
Do you want to answer that? Yeah, you want.
Yeah, it's a loss exceedance in a given year. So in a given 12 months, it's not specifically anchored around a calendar year, but in a given 12 months. So when we talk about the 100-year loss being, 1.2 billion, what we're saying is that there's a 1 in 100-year chance or 1% chance in a year of having that loss or greater.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so I'll put myself on the list. In terms that this is the first cut of the probable model, and you say it doesn't include surge, is it possible as you go further through the modelling that the amount of assets assessed that need to be replaced may actually still go up? Or, this is like the first outcome. So how accurate is this outcome in the sense of, is it going to be changed again?
Potentially, we've actually got a decision coming through the Audit and Risk Committee paper to endorse us or not to go on with the next phase of modelling. And what that will be another phase of deterministic modelling, which we've been advised is best placed to follow this probabilistic modelling. But essentially what that does is we will have another round of increasing the complexity of the modelling, of the data inputs. And by that, I mean, for example, if a building has base isolation or other aspects that will perform well and look good in the modelling from an earthquake perspective, we want to make sure that all of that is reflected in our data before we go into the next round. And essentially the outcome of the next round will be a down to the asset level assessment of how well the assets across the portfolio will perform. So we've asked in the Audit and Risk Committee paper, sorry I'm jumping ahead to Wednesday, if we can delay that by 6 to 9 months, because one, the modelling will take a reasonable amount of time, but two, we want to make sure that that data is super sharp when we put it into the model.
Okay, thank you. And my other question is, over the past decade or more, the council spent hundreds of millions strengthening buildings. Has that building strengthening actually contributed to the lowered assets at risk, like measurably?
Yeah, that's one of the key movements that you'll see within the report, in particular in the above ground policy, the resilience in the buildings, but also retaining walls, seawalls, and those sorts of things. Those assets are all in there, and they will add to the resilience within the portfolio.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Free.
So I was very interested that the housing portfolio, the risk went up because it wasn't very diversified, but the pipes went down because they were quite diversified. Given what you now know, does this mean the airport is also sitting in an area of relatively high risk or not?
Sam, can you take that one that's not an asset that we modelled? Do you have an...
We haven't modelled that. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure that I can be categoric in what I can say, but what I generally flat areas of land in that part of the world, shall we say, are going to have areas which are going to liquefy, and so the likelihood is that if there is a big shake that causes a lot of land deformation across Wellington, that the airport will be affected by the same event. I think we can say that. To what extent, I would have to come back to you and give more of a nuanced opinion, but gut feel, if we want to go with that, would say that if Wellington is badly impacted, that the airport would also be badly impacted. The building might be okay, but the runways might not survive, shall we say. That certainly deformation is an issue for those type of assets.
I think also we don't want to have an opinion on other people's assets. They're actually, I mean, we have an investment there, but that's not for us to model, shall we say.
Fair enough. My other question was then about the new district plan. The risk factors for somewhere like Kilburnie had actually changed. Does any of this work actually have implications on a review for the district plan?
Not immediately, but certainly, as we work through this journey, we'll be linking in with the team.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Calvert.
Thank you. Whilst I appreciate this is just for council's assets, is there an opportunity for some of this analysis to be able to reflect on the broader Wellington insurance market to help with rates?
So I'll perhaps let Aon answer that question. What I would say is that for us, some small entities like our CCOs, also for the whare waka, we also put their assets through this modelling because we have a close relationship with them, and that would be beneficial to them to have this better detail. So we certainly did wrap that up in this work as well. But Aon, you might have a view.
So is the question around, is the better understanding going to be applicable, or is it something else? Sorry, can you just clarify what the question is?
It's about better understanding really in terms of, because what we do hear from a lot of people in Wellington, business owners and just residential owners, that our insurance rates are a lot higher than other parts of the country. And really this is about a broader thing about could we see some of this information being used to help support a claim or whatever, not necessarily claim, but to justify that Wellington may be being overcharged for its insurance rates overall?
I can't comment on the last bit, but what I would say is that the better understanding of the hazard, the issues that we've got, and how land or slopes or how assets will perform, especially if we've got a better understanding of, say, localized roading or localized reticulation and how well that will perform, that might give some comfort to people to know that their assets are resilient, and therefore in the event of a loss or an event that they're going to have water or access to water. I don't think it's very hard to correlate the work that's been done here, which is very much specific on Wellington City Council's assets, to the assets owned by other people, and then the interpretation of that by insurers on whether or not they think they're good risks or not. The macro issue is there simply is not enough capacity, full stop, for Wellington. And that's predominantly driven by increasing values of assets, and we continue to build. And the insurance market is not providing sufficient capacity, and it's not the local insurers, it's the reinsurers, it's the global capacity that's constrained, because we need more capacity generally. And if you think it's unique to Wellington, it's not. We're seeing the same issue in Florida, same issue in California for earthquake, Florida, it's hurricane. So this is it's an issue that we're wanting to unravel, but it's not straightforward.
Thank you. And just my second question, when did you first, for Aon, when did you first indicate to the council that there was a likelihood of significant reduction in from the 2.6 down to the 1.8?
Can I just note that the 2.6 calculation to the 1.8, that's our calculation, so what we do is we take the advice that we get from Aon, and then we look at that against a whole other number of parameters in our asset base, and we calculate that. But I'll let Aon answer the question around, when did they inform us?
I don't think the timeline is that different to what's already been mentioned, but I would say that, it's the issue we've got with reports is when we give a number, and what it's an issue that I've got with the GNS model at the moment. Ideally, the probabilistic modelling should give you a range, because it's giving you the mean at the moment, but ideally we need a range. And it's something I've said to GNS was we need to be able to give that range, because you need to know what's a good day and what's a bad day. Even at the 100-year event, it's not 1.2 billion. It's going to be between $100 and $2 billion. I don't know what the numbers are, but we need to know what that sort of range is. And that's the whole point of this, is that we sometimes get fixated on individual numbers, and the modelling is basically a representation of the best that we understand it at the moment. And as information gets updated and asset information, we get better information, the modelling improves. And it's a matter of reducing that uncertainty so that you can make informed decisions. But the key part here is interpreting those numbers in the right way so that you can make good decisions.
Okay, so when did you give us the modelling?
So I believe the first drafts would have gone through around August, and then the most recent final report was within the last couple of weeks. And just to build on Sam's point, the outputs from us here is a loss exceedance curve, and that's based on that 100,000-year catalogue of events, which includes really small events. And if you were to anchor on, the gap based on those small events, you get a different answer to if you anchored based on the large events, and you get a different answer to if you anchored based on some statistical summary of that loss exceedance curve. So that's the output we're receiving.
I think the August information didn't include any of the transport information that we've got here and our full asset base. So just to clarify that, the information, they were interim, and it was just at the high level. We only received the final information on the 14th.
Okay, Councillor.
Yeah, it's an iterative process, and there's been a feedback loop as we've gone through this to make sure that we're making good assumptions as we go through.
Can I also add to that the information we received in August was I requested that to give an update to the Audit and Risk Committee, and it was as the modelling was in train, it hadn't been finalised or completed at that stage.
Okay, sorry, Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you. I'm interested in the 2024 assurance analysis and any potential hidden cost that might be, and noting that our assets all need to be recorded in a GIS assessment. How frequently do we update the GIS assessment, or is that a level of service that we don't currently have? Like, how long will it take for the assets to be in that system? And also, what level of information, assuming we need more info about pipes than we might say an above ground cycle line?
Yeah, so we are constantly updating information through our fixed asset register and through our GIS records. What we do is we take our list of assets and get our GIS team to do an export of those assets matched against their GIS file, which is then one of the key inputs into the modelling that Aon does. So we can have that turned around by our internal team within 3 to 4 weeks.
Cool. So that's not something that we need to increase our capability. There's no hidden cost to changing to the new framework. Sweet. My second part was just around, Andrea, you mentioned that the advice from Aon and is put into a system with further parameters of the asset base considers. What are those parameters?
So what we would be looking to do as additional information is to get specific engineering assessments on the portion of the portfolio that is high value. So that's talking about your really large buildings. And then we would have those assessments translated into inputs that we can use within the model.
Okay, thank you.
Can I, sorry, just jump in there. So very quickly. So there's 3 components to a model. There's the hazard, there's your assets, and then there's the vulnerability functions, what happens to them. Basically, it's an ongoing process, so all the time. So the hazard piece was updated by GNS 2022. That's the latest and greatest. Your asset information and more information, valuations is something that's always ongoing. And then the vulnerability, the functions, the bits that we sort of say, well, how does it perform? That also sort of linked to the asset, but it's also always been updated. And it's so every iteration, the key thing here is we capture the assumptions that we've made at this iteration. And then when we go to it next time, we'll explain that and say, these are the differences and why we're getting different outcomes. But this is very, very complex. It's a very complex problem. And we're trying to give a very sort of simple solution. It's as you can tell, it's not easy. So but it's an iterative process. There's the right answer is out there. We're just not there yet.
Okay, thank you. Bruce, you've got a question or two.
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and thank you, Andrea and team, for the presentation. This is very informative. A couple of observations, Tony. One is, as I have been led to believe, it's clear that we risk overusing the word. We can get fixated on one number when we need a range, which strikes me as really important. The second point that came out of our last workshop with you, Sam, which I thought was really useful as well, was actually we still have to define probably our risk appetite, and I think that's going to be very difficult. My question, and it's possibly for you, Sam, is that the challenge in front of council is a credible financial strategy for the next 10 years. Let's make it 9. Now we're nearly a year down. How much could this, obviously the data could change, but I'm thinking here about cost. Let's call it under insurance. What could it be like in 10 years' time? Does your model in any way deal with that? The reason I ask that question is that I want a balance sheet that meets and builds the issues we face in 10 years' time, not just now. Does that make sense? I need a financial strategy to build strength over time.
Yeah, if I had that crystal ball, I wouldn't be sat here. I'd be a multi-millionaire somewhere. But I think the insurance sector is not going to go away. You know, like the insurance sector is looking to protect and make it self-sustainable. And so I think there's an issue here around if you kept building and building and building, that the problem would get bigger. But I think your strategy, the approach, and that's the whole point of that roadmap, is to say, I think the problem now, you've got your hands around the problem. It's now, how do we start? We can't fix all of it, but we can certainly start like nibbling away at it. So, you know, can you retain more risk? Are we adequately capturing the physical investment that's being put in? So to identify the buildings which are, you know, good risks, and is that being adequately portrayed? If you've got risks which are, you know, buildings which are not essential and not great, there needs to be a conversation, a hard conversation about what happens to those. So I think what I would say is that the roadmap, the strategy around that is being very, very useful. And I'm hoping now that people are starting to get their head around this is a complex problem, but we're starting to get the enormity of it. Traditional risk transfer may morph in 5-10 years' time for certain perils. Honestly, that's more likely to be around flood risk, climate change risk, where insurers are getting burnt and they're just going to say, well, we're not going to do. That's not the issue here. The risk here is the earthquake risk. And it's like the two hurricanes that's just gone through the US have had no impact at all on the reinsurance of America or the reinsurance costs globally, because they are factored in. The earthquake risk for New Zealand is being factored into the numbers that the insurers are crunching. So I'm confident, as much as I can be, that the insurance market will be there. Then the clever bit is, if traditional is not available, what else is available? And that's the bit where we're looking at, can we do better retentions? Can we look at catastrophe bonds or other ways of getting other forms of capital to help? But I think the key thing here is, and the journey that you started on, and I really applaud you for, is you've invested in understanding the problem first before we've started jumping to a solution. And I think that's the most important thing here, is you started the journey, you've just got to stick the course, but you're on the right path.
Yeah, I think it was almost, and you know, I said you've got to always have a range of numbers. So I was almost wanting to say, can you tell me what the number will be in 10 years' time? British, so can you tell me what the range is in 10 years' time? Yeah, you know,
for your loss expectancies or for the premium?
Yeah. Well, probably, ideally both, because our financial strategy is not fixed. You know, I suspect rates will go up. There could be other sources of revenue, but in the long run, we're trying to plan prudently for year 10 as much as what we face right at the moment. Look, I think that's an open question, but it's one I'd like to explore more on this journey, because I suspect we're having to build for a bigger level of resilience than even we're looking at right at the moment.
Okay.
Quite possibly, and I guess the big unknown, even from our point of view, and is what happens with the Three Waters. You know, there's quite a lot of unknowns here, but you know, the modelling can be updated. We've got a pretty good. We don't have a 10-year window, but we can certainly give you 12, 18, 24 months, and we've got a pretty good feel of how things are going. And as well as we capture more of the information that's becoming available from yourselves and other sources, be it GNS, NIWA, we can incorporate that into the thinking and the modelling. But I know it's a 9-year LTP now. It's very hard for us to give you that sort of certainty, but certainly 2 years, 3 years, we can give you a good sort of steer on where we think it's going.
I thought you guys are magicians, but okay, there we go.
Thank you, Bruce. Look, I'm just conscious we've got three more questioners on the list. Can we just? Is it okay to extend it a couple of more minutes? I'm not sure if that's. Yes. So thank you, Andrea and Barbara. Councillor Winera, you've got a question or two. Please be quick.
That's okay. Look, if we're pressed for time, I can just put it through in writing. All good.
Okay, so, and I'm just conscious, Councillor Pennant, you wanted one last question.
Really quickly, the captive study, is that really complex and cost a lot of money? Why are you coming for agreement from committee?
So that what we're asking for is the word slipped out of my mind now.
Endorsement.
Endorsement for the feasibility study for the captive. So we're looking. We talked about this last week briefly, I think, Sam, didn't we? It's about testing to see whether the metrics that we have here at council make sense.
That's fine. It's just how much is it? Is it it's going to take months and months and months?
It's a couple of months worth of work, and it's $30,000-40,000.
Okay,
It's not huge, and it's taken care of within budgets that we have.
That's fine. And just one other quick question. Sorry, Andrea. So the other councils with high earthquake risk, they should be all doing the same sort of thing that we're doing, and you're also not putting climate change repeated events on the same sort of scale as earthquakes because they could end up costing a lot of money.
Earthquakes are our major risks, so that's what we're looking at in this situation. Other councils that face similar risks should absolutely be doing this to inform their approach, and there are some other councils that are doing it. We're quite far along our insurance roadmap journey, and I know that we've certainly been a very strong advocate across the local government sector for doing this kind of work, and certainly I've talked to Tai Tuara for smaller councils to pool their resources to do this type of work, because I recognise that they don't all have that capability and capacity.
Okay, so Councillor Chung, is a quick question?
Yep, very quick question. You mentioned that we have to look at the insurance of our high-value buildings. Now, at the moment, we have a blanket insurance for 750 million plus 120 million, the new one, 70 million. So if you start specifying or looking at the value of our high-value buildings, would that increase our premiums, exactly the same way as it would do on a specified item on your own home insurance?
They'll still be insured in largely the same way. What it will inform you of is another item we have on the roadmap, which is asset prioritisation and selection, which is another thing that we need to look at in detail about not just what we insure, but how we decide to insure it, overlaying our risk appetite to that, and how much post-event we would choose to rebuild versus other assets that we may look to not necessarily replace like for like.
Okay, so I'd just like to thank officers and Sam and Matt from Aon for taking the time to explain what is actually a really complicated model, but it's a complicated model because we need an accurate model, because this is a big vulnerability. It's a very important part of our responsibility as a councillor. So I do thank you guys for taking the time and also for all the questions. And also just to remind people that this is actually good news. A better model is showing that we've got a bit less pressure than we thought, even though we've got a lot. Okay, so thank you. I'll finish the workshop there. Thank you.